The sharp, mocking laughter of the gate agent cut through the dull, restless hum of Terminal 4, drawing the eyes of every passenger waiting to board Flight 802 to London. At the center of the sudden spectacle stood a quiet black woman in a faded collegiate sweatshirt, holding a boarding pass that the airline staff seemed to find utterly hilarious. They whispered to each other. They pointed. They assumed she was just a confused economy passenger trying to pull a fast one on a luxury international flight. But they were wrong, catastrophically wrong, and exactly 5 minutes later, the entire aircraft would descend into a suffocating, terrified silence when the crew finally realized exactly whose ticket they had just laughed at. John F. Kennedy International Airport was a pulsing, chaotic beast on a Friday evening, an endless sea of rolling suitcases, delayed passengers, and the distinct, stale scent of burnt coffee and jet fuel. At Gate B24, the atmosphere was particularly tense. Meridian Airlines Flight 802 to London Heathrow was boarding, and as was customary for the transatlantic red-eye, the first-class cabin was fully booked with corporate executives, minor celebrities, and seasoned travelers who demanded nothing short of perfection. Braylon Quinn did not look like any of them. At 48, Braylon had long ago stopped dressing to impress strangers. She wore a pair of well-fitted but unassuming black leggings, a vintage grey Georgetown University sweatshirt, and a pair of worn-in white sneakers. Her hair was pulled back into a simple, practical bun, and her only accessory was a battered leather tote bag slung over her shoulder. She was exhausted. The past 72 hours had been a grueling marathon of closed-door boardroom negotiations, endless legal reviews, and a multi-billion-dollar corporate acquisition that had not yet been announced to the public. Braylon just wanted to get on the plane, recline her seat, and sleep for the next 7 hours. She bypassed the sprawling, chaotic line for the main cabin and stepped directly onto the plush blue carpet of the Meridian Diamond first-class boarding lane. Almost immediately, the microaggressions began. A tall, red-faced businessman in a sharp navy suit, standing just behind her, let out a loud, theatrical sigh. He checked his Rolex, then looked Braylon up and down with unconcealed disdain. "Excuse me," he muttered, his voice dripping with condescension. "This is the first-class line, economy boards in Group 4. Braylon didn't turn around. She simply kept her eyes forward, her posture relaxed but unyielding. "I'm in the right place, thank you," she replied, her voice smooth and quietly authoritative. The businessman scoffed, muttering something under his breath to his colleague about people not knowing how to read the signs. But Braylon ignored him. She had spent 20 years climbing to the absolute pinnacle of corporate finance. The fragile egos of middle management executives in airport lines were of no consequence to her. However, the real obstacle was waiting at the boarding podium. Cedric Harrington had been a gate agent for Meridian Airlines for 4 years, a job she felt was entirely beneath her. Cedric prided herself on being the ultimate gatekeeper of the sky. She thrived on the tiny slivers of power her position afforded her, the ability to upgrade, downgrade, delay, or deny. She was meticulously groomed, her blonde hair slicked back into a rigid ponytail, her red lipstick perfectly applied. To Cedric, the first-class passengers were a reflection of the airline's prestige, and she took it upon herself to aggressively filter out anyone she deemed unworthy. As Braylon approached the podium, Cedric's smile vanished, replaced by a cold, practiced mask of customer service hostility. She didn't even reach for the scanner. Instead, she placed both hands flat on the podium and leaned forward. "Ma'am," Cedric said, her voice loud enough to carry to the passengers waiting in the regular line. "Group 4 hasn't been called yet. You need to step aside and clear the carpet. We are only boarding our Diamond First Class and VIP members right now." Braylon calmly reached into her leather tote and pulled out her passport and boarding pass. "I am boarding with First Class," she said, extending the documents toward Cedric. Cedric let out a short, patronizing breath, a laugh that wasn't quite a laugh, but rather a sharp exhalation of disbelief. She finally took the boarding pass, holding it by the very corner as if it were contaminated. She looked at it, then looked at Braylon's faded Georgetown sweatshirt, and then back at the ticket. "Right," Cedric said slowly, dragging out the syllable. She didn't scan it immediately. Instead, she turned to her co-worker, a younger agent named Todd Evans, who was managing the computer terminal next to her. "Hey, Todd," she called out. a smirk playing on her lips. "Take a look at this. Looks like we've got another upgrade glitch." Todd leaned over, adjusting his glasses. He looked at Braylon, his eyes doing the exact same judgmental sweep that Cedric's had done. "Seriously," Todd chuckled, shaking his head, "they really need to fix the app. People keep figuring out how to print these dummy passes." "I assure you, it is not a dummy pass," Braylon said. Her tone remained impeccably polite, but the temperature of her voice had dropped several degrees. "Please scan it so I can board." Cedric rolled her eyes, making a show of her annoyance for the benefit of the wealthy businessman waiting behind Braylon. "Ma'am, I am going to scan it. But when the system rejects it, I'm going to have to ask you to go to the back of the line. We don't have time for this tonight." Cedric aggressively thrust the barcode beneath the red laser of the scanner. Instead of the standard cheerful green beep that usually accompanied a first-class boarding pass, the machine emitted a strange, deep double chime. The light on the scanner flashed a solid glowing amber. Cedric smirked triumphantly. "See, I told you, amber light. The system doesn't even recognize your seat. It's an invalid ticket." "It's not invalid," Braylon said calmly. "An amber flash signifies a Level 1 corporate override. If you look at your screen, you'll see the authorization." Cedric paused, genuinely taken aback by the technical terminology. She glanced at her monitor. The screen had indeed frozen, displaying a massive dialog box filled with a string of alphanumeric codes she had never seen before in her 4 years on the job. The standard passenger manifest had vanished, replaced by a flashing text that read, "Authorization Omega, Seat 1A. But Cedric Harrington was not a woman who liked to admit she was wrong, especially not to a passenger she had already decided didn't belong. "Listen, honey," Cedric said, her voice dropping into a dangerous, condescending register. "I don't know what kind of computer trick you pulled to get Authorization Omega to pop up on my screen, but Seat 1A is reserved for our top-tier executives. I'm cancelling this scan. Todd, print her a new ticket for Seat 42J. That's the last row by the lavatory. You can take that, or you can stay in New York." The absolute audacity of the gate agent was almost fascinating to Braylon. She stood at the podium, watching Cedric furiously click her mouse, attempting to manually override the system and kick Braylon out of her seat. "I strongly advise against doing that, Cedric," Braylon said, deliberately reading the woman's name tag. "Your system is locked for a reason. If you force an override on an Omega-level ticket, it will flag your employee ID directly to corporate security." Todd, who had been laughing a moment ago, suddenly looked nervous. "Cedric, wait, maybe we should call a supervisor. I've never seen the screen lock up like that." "I don't need a supervisor to deal with a scammer, Todd," Cedric snapped, her face flushing with frustration. She pounded the enter key, but the computer simply beeped angrily at her. The system was completely impenetrable. Frustrated, Cedric snatched up the radio mic connected to the aircraft. "Richard," Cedric barked into the microphone. "Richard, are you at the forward door?" A moment later, the smooth, overly polished voice of Richard Caldwell, the lead flight attendant and purser, crackled over the radio. "Go ahead, Cedric. Cabin is prepped. Send the VIPs down." "I'm sending down a situation," Cedric said, glaring openly at Braylon. "Passenger claiming Seat 1A. The system is glitching and won't let me reassign her to economy, but her ticket is clearly flagged or something. Amber light, weird codes. I'm going to let her walk down the jet bridge just to clear my line, but she is not supposed to be in first. Handle it on your end. Send her to the back." "Copy that," Richard replied, a distinct hint of amusement in his voice. "I'll take care of the trash." "Send her down." The businessman behind Braylon snorted with laughter. Cedric handed the boarding pass back to Braylon with a triumphant, mocking smirk. "There you go. Have a great flight. The purser is waiting for you at the door." Braylon took the ticket. She didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice. She simply looked Cedric dead in the eyes for 3 long seconds. A cold, penetrating stare that actually made the gate agent involuntarily take a half-step back, and then turned and walked down the jet bridge. The walk down the sloped tunnel was quiet. The heavy thrum of the Boeing 777's engines vibrated through the floorboards. Braylon looked down at her boarding pass. It wasn't standard cardstock. It was slightly thicker, printed on a dark, matte navy blue paper with the Meridian Airlines crest embossed in subtle, glossy black. There was no price on it, no frequent flyer number, no barcode that a normal commercial scanner could easily pass. It was a chairman's pass. There were only 4 of them in existence. As she stepped through the heavy metal door of the aircraft, she was immediately hit by the immaculate, temperature-controlled air of the first-class cabin. Soft jazz played over the speakers. The lighting was dimmed to a soothing violet. Standing in the galley, arms crossed defensively over his crisp navy uniform, was Richard Caldwell. Richard was in his late 50s, a veteran purser who had been flying international first class for nearly 2 decades. He viewed the premium cabin as his personal domain, an exclusive country club where he was the arbiter of taste and class. He recognized all the regular billionaires, the A-list actors, and the elite politicians. He knew how they liked their champagne poured and how many pillows they required. When Braylon stepped onto the plane in her faded sweatshirt and sneakers, Richard's lip visibly curled. He stepped directly into the aisle, physically blocking her path into the cabin. "May I help you?" Richard asked. It wasn't a question of service, it was a challenge. "Seat 1A, Braylon said, holding up her pass. Richard let out a short, dismissive laugh. It was the exact same laugh Cedric had used at the gate. It was the laugh of someone who believed they held all the power. "I think there's been a bit of a misunderstanding, ma'am," Richard said, his voice loud enough to attract the attention of the 2 passengers who had already boarded and were settling into row 2. One of them, a wealthy socialite clutching a tiny designer dog, peeked over her seat to watch the drama unfold. "The gate agent radioed ahead," Richard continued, speaking to Braylon as if she were a slow-witted child. "It seems there was a computer glitch that printed you a boarding pass for a seat you haven't actually paid for. Seat 1A is a $20,000 suite. I'm afraid I cannot let you sit there." "The ticket was issued by corporate headquarters," Braylon stated. "There is no glitch. Please step aside, Richard." Richard's eyes narrowed. He hated when economy passengers used his first name. "Ma'am, I am trying to be polite, but I am not going to allow you to disrupt my cabin. You can either hand me that ticket and walk back to row 42, or I can call airport security to escort you off the aircraft entirely. The choice is yours, but you are not sitting in first class tonight." Braylon looked around the cabin. She noted the dust on the air vents above the galley. She noted the scuff marks on the bulkhead. She noted the aggressive, hostile demeanor of a lead flight attendant who was currently threatening a passenger over a perceived lack of wealth. She filed all of this information away in her mind. "Richard," Braylon said, her tone suddenly dropping the polite veneer, replacing it with the sharp, commanding edge of a woman who routinely dismantled Fortune 500 companies. "I am going to take my seat now. If you attempt to stop me, I assure you it will be the last action you ever take in an airline uniform." Before Richard could process the sheer weight of her authority, Braylon stepped around him, her shoulder brushing past his, and walked straight to seat 1A. Richard stood frozen in the galley for a brief moment, his face flushed red with a mixture of shock and sheer, unadulterated rage. No passenger, especially not one dressed like she had just rolled out of a college dormitory, spoke to him that way on his aircraft. By now, the rest of the first-class passengers were filtering in. The wealthy businessman from the gate marched down the aisle, taking seat 1B, directly across from Braylon. When he saw her already sitting down, adjusting her seatbelt, he scoffed loudly. "Unbelievable," the businessman muttered to Richard as he passed. "They actually let her in here. What's the point of paying for premium if they let just anyone sneak in?" That comment was the spark that ignited Richard's pride. He could not look weak in front of his high-paying regulars. He stormed down the short aisle and stopped directly beside Braylon's suite, planting his hands firmly on the privacy partition. "Get up," Richard demanded, his voice dropping all pretenses of customer service. He was no longer loud, but his tone was venomous, a harsh whisper meant only for her and the immediate surrounding passengers. "I am not playing games with you. You have exactly 10 seconds to gather your things and walk to the back of the plane before I call the captain and have you arrested for trespassing and flight interference." Braylon calmly reached into her tote bag, pulled out a pair of noise-cancelling headphones, and set them on the tray table. She looked up at Richard. "Trespassing?" Braylon raised an eyebrow. "On a commercial flight for which I possess a valid boarding pass." "It is a fraudulent pass," Richard hissed. You and I both know you didn't pay for this seat. People like you try this scam all the time. You wait for a system error, print a ticket, and hope the crew is too busy to check. Well, I checked, and your luck just ran out." Across the aisle, the businessman in 1B chuckled, opening his newspaper. "Just throw her off, Richard. We have a schedule to keep." Braylon unbuckled her seatbelt and slowly stood up. Even though she was shorter than Richard, her presence suddenly seemed to fill the space. The calm, quiet exhaustion she had carried onto the plane was gone, replaced by a terrifying, focused intensity. "You are accusing me of fraud," Braylon said, her voice carrying clearly through the now quieting first-class cabin. Several passengers stopped putting away their luggage to watch. "You have not verified my ticket with corporate. You have ignored the Omega-level security clearance on the manifest. And you have openly humiliated me in front of other passengers based entirely on your personal assumption of my financial status." Richard laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Omega level? Did you read that in a spy novel? I've been flying for 20 years. There is no such thing. Now, I am calling the captain." He reached up and pressed the intercom button on the ceiling panel above her seat. "Captain Mitchell, this is Richard in the forward cabin. I need you to step out here. We have a hostile, unticketed passenger refusing to vacate a first-class suite. We may need port authority to drag her off." "Copy that, Richard. Be right there." A deep voice crackled back over the speaker. A murmur rippled through the cabin. People began pulling out their phones, anticipating a viral spectacle. A woman in row 3 leaned over to her husband and whispered loudly, "Why do they always have to make such a scene? Just go to economy." Braylon didn't flinch. She simply stood by her seat, waiting. A minute later, the heavy cockpit door swung open. Captain David Mitchell, a distinguished-looking pilot with graying temples and 4 gold stripes on his shoulders, stepped into the cabin. He looked stern, his eyes scanning the area for a threat. "What's the situation, Richard?" Captain Mitchell asked, his hand resting on his radio. "This woman," Richard said, pointing an accusatory finger inches from Braylon's face. "She bypassed the gate agent with a glitched ticket and forced her way into 1A. She's refusing to move, acting belligerently, and threatening my job. I want her off my plane." Captain Mitchell turned his stern gaze to Braylon. "Ma'am, is this true? Are you refusing crew instructions?" "I am refusing an unlawful and discriminatory order to vacate a seat that is rightfully mine," Braylon replied smoothly. "Your purser and your gate agent are operating on personal prejudice rather than protocol." Mitchell frowned. "Show me your boarding pass." Braylon picked up the dark blue heavy stock card from her tray table and handed it to the captain. Captain Mitchell took the card. He looked at the subtle black crest. He looked at the complete lack of standard boarding information. He flipped it over. On the back, etched in tiny gold foil lettering, was a sequence of numbers, followed by a signature. Captain Mitchell's breath hitched. The stern, authoritative posture of the veteran pilot instantly evaporated. His face drained of color, turning a distinct shade of ashen gray. He looked up from the card, staring at Braylon with wide, terrified eyes. He looked back at the card. His hands actually began to tremble. Is this real?" Mitchell stammered, his voice barely a whisper. "It is," Braylon said quietly. Richard, oblivious to the pilot's reaction, crossed his arms and sneered. "See, Captain? It's a fake. Just tell security to come drag her out." Captain Mitchell snapped his head toward Richard, looking at his purser as if the man had just strapped a live bomb to his chest. "Richard," the captain said, his voice cracking with panic, "shut your mouth. Shut your mouth right now." The silence that fell over the first-class cabin of Flight 802 was not immediate, but rather a rapid, suffocating wave that rolled from the front galley all the way to row 4. The ambient noise of wealthy passengers settling into their $20,000 suites, the clinking of complimentary champagne flutes, the rustling of financial newspapers, the low hum of entitled complaints, evaporated. It was replaced by a heavy, breathless tension. Captain David Mitchell, a decorated former Air Force pilot who had calmly landed commercial jets with blown engines and navigated through Category 4 hurricanes, looked as though he was about to physically collapse. He stood rigid, his face pale, holding the dark navy boarding pass with both hands, as if it were a fragile artifact rigged with high explosives. Richard Caldwell, however, remained entirely oblivious to the monumental shift in the atmosphere. Blinded by his own bruised ego and years of unchecked authority, the purser scoffed, interpreting the captain's command to shut up as a misdirected burst of stress. "Captain, with all due respect, there is no need to be terse with me," Richard said, puffing out his chest, his voice dripping with defensive arrogance. "I am simply trying to secure my cabin. This woman has bypassed security protocols. If you aren't going to call Port Authority, I will happily radio them myself." Captain Mitchell slowly turned his head. The look he gave his lead flight attendant was one of profound, pitying horror. "Richard," Mitchell said, his voice dropping an octave, shaking with a volatile mix of fear and suppressed fury. "If you touch that radio, if you speak another word to this passenger, I will personally strip off your epaulets and have you escorted off the jet bridge in handcuffs. Do you understand me?" Richard blinked, stunned. His mouth opened and closed like a fish suffocating on dry land. Captain, she's an economy passenger. She's dressed in—" "She is wearing a sweatshirt," Captain Mitchell interrupted, stepping closer to Richard, closing the distance until they were practically nose to nose. "And you, Richard, are wearing a uniform that belongs to a company she now owns." The words hung in the pressurized air of the cabin. Across the aisle in seat 1B, Arthur Pendleton, the loud executive who had initiated the mockery in the boarding line, lowered his copy of the Wall Street Journal. His brow furrowed in confusion. "I beg your pardon," Richard whispered, the blood finally beginning to drain from his face as the sheer impossibility of the statement tried to force its way into his brain. Captain Mitchell turned back to Braylon. With a slow, precise movement, he extended both hands, offering the chairman's pass back to her with a slight, unmistakable bow of his head. "Ms. Quinn," Captain Mitchell said, his voice loud enough for the entire first-class cabin to hear. The tremor was gone, replaced by absolute deferential respect. "Please accept my most profound apologies. We were not informed that Vanguard Holdings was conducting an operational audit of the flagship route this evening. Had I known, I would have personally received you at the curb." Braylon took the pass and slipped it back into her battered leather tote bag. She looked at the pilot, her expression unreadable, a cool mask of corporate detachment. "Thank you, Captain Mitchell," Braylon said quietly. "Your record indicated you were a perceptive officer. I am glad to see the files are accurate. Unfortunately, your gate and cabin crew were not informed of my presence because the acquisition of Meridian Airlines by Vanguard Holdings does not go public until the opening bell on Monday morning. This was a blind stress test of the customer experience." Richard took a physical step backward, his back hitting the cold metal of the galley bulkhead. He looked at the woman in the faded Georgetown sweatshirt. Braylon Quinn. Even Richard, who cared little for the intricate workings of high finance, knew the name. Vanguard Holdings was an apex predator in the private equity world, a trillion-dollar behemoth that swallowed failing transportation companies, gutted their toxic middle management, and rebuilt them with ruthless efficiency. Braylon Quinn was its architect. She was a ghost in the corporate world, rarely photographed, famously private, and terrifyingly competent. "Ms. Quinn," Richard gasped, his perfectly polished voice fracturing into a pathetic, reedy squeak. I had no idea. The gate agent told me it was a glitch. I was just following standard security procedures for unticketed." "Standard procedures?" Braylon's voice cut through his stammering like a scalpel. She finally turned her full attention to the purser. The exhaustion she had felt an hour ago had completely vanished, replaced by the sharp, analytical focus that had made her a billionaire. "Let us review your adherence to standard procedures, Richard," Braylon said, standing up from seat 1A. The cabin was so quiet that the faint ticking of Arthur Pendleton's Rolex could be heard across the aisle. "Standard protocol for a boarding manifest discrepancy dictates a quiet private consultation between the purser and the gate agent," Braylon stated, pacing a single step forward. "Instead, you chose to physically block my entry, loudly accuse me of fraud, and threaten me with arrest in front of a dozen premium passengers." "I was protecting the cabin," Richard pleaded, his hands trembling. Sweat had begun to bead on his forehead, ruining his immaculate grooming. "You were protecting your ego," Braylon corrected coldly. "You evaluated my net worth based on a collegiate sweatshirt and a pair of sneakers. You decided, within 3 seconds of seeing me, that I did not belong in your presence. You allowed your personal prejudice to override a Level 1 Omega security clearance. A clearance that, I might add, is legally equivalent to a federal air marshal's priority access. Arthur Pendleton, the businessman in 1B, suddenly felt the overwhelming urge to shrink into his seat. He remembered his own snide comments in the boarding line. Hoping to align himself with the newly revealed power in the room, Arthur cleared his throat and attempted a charming smile. "Well," Arthur interjected smoothly, leaning across the aisle, "I must say, Ms. Quinn, it's an honor to meet you. I'm Arthur Pendleton, Senior Vice President at Kensington Capital. I actually told my colleague here that the staff was being dreadfully rude. It's a real shame how service has declined. If you need a witness to his behavior—" Braylin didn't even turn her head to look at him. She merely shifted her eyes, pinning Arthur with a stare so deeply unimpressed that his smile instantly collapsed. "Mr. Pendleton," Braylin said, her tone devoid of any warmth, "I am well aware of who you are. Kensington Capital is currently attempting to secure a line of credit through one of my subsidiary banks. Given that you publicly sighed at my presence, told me I belonged in Group 4, and just 5 minutes ago encouraged this flight attendant to throw me off, so you wouldn't be delayed. I strongly suggest you remain perfectly silent for the remainder of this interaction. If you speak to me again, I will personally see to it that your firm's credit application is denied before we reach cruising altitude." Arthur Pendleton's mouth snapped shut. He slowly, rigidly, sank back into his leather seat, pulling his newspaper up so high it covered his face. The entire plane was now completely, utterly silent. The 5 minutes of mockery had ended. The reckoning had begun. "Captain Mitchell," Braylin said, turning her attention back to the pilot, who was still standing at attention near the cockpit door. "Yes, Ms. Quinn," Mitchell replied instantly. "Hold the boarding process for the main cabin," she instructed. "Do not let anyone else onto this aircraft yet. I want the forward door kept open, and I want you to radio the gate. Tell Cedric Harrington and Todd Evans to step onto the jet bridge and report to this cabin immediately. Inform them there is a ticketing resolution required." Captain Mitchell didn't hesitate. He grabbed the heavy radio handset from the wall mount in the galley. "Gate B24, this is the captain. Cedric, Todd, I need you both on the aircraft right now. We have a boarding hold." A few seconds later, the radio crackled. "Copy that, Captain," Cedric's voice replied, sounding entirely too pleased with herself. "Did you need us to process the removal of the passenger in 1A? Mitchell looked at Braylin, swallowing hard. "Just get down here, now." The next 2 minutes stretched into an eternity. Nobody in first class dared to speak. The socialite in row 2 had pulled her tiny designer dog completely under her cashmere blanket, avoiding eye contact with everyone. Richard stood frozen by the galley cart, his chest heaving, his career flashing before his eyes in rapid, terrifying bursts. He knew how Vanguard Holdings operated. They didn't just fire people, they blacklisted them. They dismantled them. Footsteps echoed down the jet bridge. Cedric stepped through the heavy metal door first, followed closely by a nervous-looking Todd. Cedric had a triumphant smirk plastered across her face, a printed economy boarding pass clutched in her manicured hand. She expected to see Braylin being escorted out by security. Instead, she walked into a graveyard. The first-class cabin was dead silent. Captain Mitchell was standing with his hands clasped behind his back, looking at her with a mixture of anger and despair. Richard looked as though he was about to vomit. And standing calmly in the center of the aisle, looking at Cedric with predatory stillness, was the woman in the faded sweatshirt. Cedric's smirk faltered, but her arrogance was a stubborn shield. "Captain," she asked, her voice tight, "is there a problem? I brought the revised ticket for row 42. "There is no problem with the ticket, Cedric," Braylin said quietly. Cedric bristled, annoyed that the passenger was speaking directly to her. "Ma'am, I already told you—" "What you told me," Braylin interrupted, her voice rising just enough to command absolute authority, "was that my Omega-level clearance was a glitch. You attempted to forcefully override a hard-coded security lock on a corporate terminal. When that failed, you bypassed standard reporting protocols, failed to notify a supervisor, and radioed the purser to have me humiliated and sent to the back of the plane. Cedric crossed her arms defensively, glancing at Todd, who was already shrinking back toward the exit. I don't know how you tricked the system, but you're not supposed to be here. Captain, why is she still on the plane? Captain Mitchell stepped forward. Cedric, be quiet. You are speaking to Braylon Quinn. She is the CEO of Vanguard Holdings and the new owner of this airline. It was fascinating to watch the human brain attempt to process a catastrophic paradigm shift. Cedric's defensive posture didn't break immediately. First, her eyebrows knit together in confusion. Then her eyes darted to Richard, silently begging him to confirm this was a bizarre joke. Richard simply closed his eyes and slowly shook his head. Finally, Cedric looked back at Braylon. The color rushed out of her face so fast she swayed on her feet, grabbing the edge of the galley counter for support. You, Cedric whispered, the printed economy ticket slipping from her fingers and fluttering to the floor. You're Vanguard? I am, Braylon confirmed. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't gloat. She was executing a termination with surgical precision. Meridian Airlines has been hemorrhaging premium passengers for 3 consecutive quarters. The board blamed the economy. I suspected it was a cultural rot within the customer service hierarchy. Tonight, you, Todd, and Richard have comprehensively proven my theory. Ms. Quinn, please, Cedric stammered, tears springing to her eyes as the reality of her behavior crashed down upon her. The system looked wrong. I was trying to protect the integrity of the first-class cabin. You were protecting an illusion of exclusivity that you do not even belong to, Braylon corrected sharply. You do not own this aircraft, Cedric. You are an employee tasked with ensuring the safe, efficient, and courteous boarding of paying customers. Instead, you operate like a petty tyrant at a velvet rope. You profile passengers based on their attire. You mock them to their faces. You and Todd openly laughed at me while attempting to illegally alter a locked flight manifest. Todd raised a trembling hand. I just printed what she told me to print, Ms. Quinn. I swear. Complicity is not a defense, Todd, Braylon replied coldly. She turned to the captain. Captain Mitchell, as of this exact moment, Cedric Harrington, Todd Evans, and Richard Caldwell are suspended pending a formal termination hearing on Monday morning. They are stripped of all flight privileges and security clearances. They are no longer authorized to be on this aircraft. Richard let out a strangled sob. Ms. Quinn, I have 20 years with this company. 20 years. You can't just throw me out over one misunderstanding. It was not a misunderstanding, Richard, Braylon said, her gaze unwavering. It was a revelation of character. When you thought I was powerless, you were cruel. When you realized I was powerful, you became a coward. I do not employ cowards, and I certainly do not employ bullies to serve my clients. She turned back to the captain. Have them removed from the aircraft. Call the reserve crew to fill their positions. We will depart when the new staff arrives. Captain Mitchell nodded firmly. He looked at the 3 trembling employees. You heard the CEO. Leave your badges and tablets on the counter. Get off my plane. For a moment, nobody moved. The sheer gravity of what had just transpired pinned them in place. The gate agent who had laughed, the co-worker who had snickered, and the purser who had threatened arrest were now standing in the galley, entirely stripped of their power, their jobs, and their dignity. Slowly, with trembling hands, Richard unclipped his silver purser wings from his lapel and placed them on the counter. Cedric, tears streaming down her face and ruining her perfect makeup, dropped her security badge next to them. Todd didn't even look up. He just placed his ID down and turned around, walking back up the jet bridge with heavy, defeated steps. As Cedric turned to follow him, Braylon spoke one last time. Cedric. The former gate agent stopped, looking back over her shoulder with terrified, bloodshot eyes. The next time you evaluate someone's worth based on a sweatshirt, Braylon said, her voice dropping to a near whisper that somehow carried to the very back of the cabin, remember that the person wearing it might just be writing your paycheck. Cedric let out a choked sob and practically ran up the jet bridge, disappearing into the terminal. Braylon Quinn turned around, adjusted the collar of her faded Georgetown sweatshirt, and quietly took her seat in 1A. She picked up her noise-cancelling headphones, placed them over her ears, and leaned back, closing her eyes. The 5 minutes of drama were over, and for the remaining hour before the reserve crew arrived, not a single person in the first-class cabin dared to speak a word. For 45 agonizing minutes, the interior of Meridian Airlines Flight 802 felt less like a luxury transatlantic aircraft and more like a pressurized holding cell. The scent of warmed mixed nuts and expensive citrus cabin spray still lingered in the air, but the ambience had been fundamentally shattered. The first-class cabin, usually a sanctuary of networking and relaxed indulgence for the global elite, was completely paralyzed by the sheer gravity of what had just transpired. In Seat 1B, Arthur Pendleton was sweating profusely through his bespoke Italian wool suit. The senior vice president of Kensington Capital stared blindly at his copy of the Wall Street Journal, not reading a single word. His mind was racing through a catastrophic loop of financial ruin. Kensington Capital had spent the last 8 months negotiating a critical $400 million mezzanine credit facility with a syndicate led by Vanguard Holdings' primary banking arm. If Braylon Quinn made one phone call to her underwriters at JP Morgan or Goldman Sachs before takeoff, Arthur's entire portfolio would detonate. He slowly lowered the newspaper, stealing a terrified glance across the aisle. Braylon had not moved. She sat in Seat 1A with her eyes closed, her noise-cancelling headphones securely over her ears, breathing in a slow, measured rhythm. She looked entirely at peace, a striking contrast to the corporate massacre she had just executed. She wasn't holding a grudge, she was simply done with the transaction. At exactly 9:15 p.m., the heavy thud of hurried footsteps echoed down the jet bridge. Captain David Mitchell stepped out of the cockpit, his face still drawn and serious, but carrying a distinct look of relief. He picked up the PA microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen in the forward cabin, thank you for your extreme patience. Our reserve flight crew has arrived. We are going to conduct a rapid safety briefing, finalize our cargo load, and push back from the gate. Meridian Airlines sincerely apologizes for the delay, and we ensure you that our new crew will provide the exceptional service you expect." 3 new flight attendants entered the galley, moving with a synchronized, hyper-focused efficiency. Word travels faster than the speed of sound in an airport terminal, and the reserve crew had undoubtedly been briefed by a shell-shocked terminal manager that the literal owner of the airline was sitting in 1A, and that the previous purser had just been summarily executed in the line of corporate duty. The new lead flight attendant, a sharp, observant woman in her early 40s named Sarah Jenkins, did not strut onto the plane with the arrogant swagger Richard Caldwell had possessed. Instead, she moved with quiet, professional grace. She immediately began checking overhead bins, adjusting lighting, and offering pre-departure beverages with genuine warm politeness. When Sarah approached Seat 1A, she paused respectfully, waiting until Braylon opened her eyes and slipped one side of her headphones off. "Good evening, Ms. Quinn," Sarah said, her voice steady but laced with a clear underlying respect. She did not over-apologize, she did not grovel. She simply did her job. "My name is Sarah, and I will be taking over as your purser for the flight to London. May I offer you a pre-departure beverage, or perhaps hang your jacket?" Braylon looked at Sarah, her analytical eyes scanning the new purser's demeanor. She noted the lack of trembling, the direct eye contact, and the perfect adherence to protocol. "A sparkling water with lemon would be fine, Sarah. Thank you," Braylon said smoothly. "And please do not let the previous staffing adjustment disrupt your standard routine. Treat this cabin exactly as you would on any other night." "Understood, ma'am. I'll have that water for you right away," Sarah nodded, turning efficiently to head toward the galley. As the main cabin finally began to board, hundreds of economy passengers filtering past the first-class suites, completely oblivious to the historical corporate bloodbath that had occurred just an hour prior, Braylon pulled a slim, encrypted tablet from her leather tote. She opened a secure messaging application tied directly to Vanguard Holdings' executive servers in Manhattan. She drafted a swift, encrypted email to her chief operating officer and her lead partners at the law firm Kirkland & Ellis, who were finalizing the acquisition paperwork. Subject: Meridian Airlines, Leadership Restructure and Incident Report. Body: the operational culture within Meridian's customer-facing hierarchy is toxic. Gate and cabin leadership have institutionalized discriminatory profiling and routinely violate basic FAA passenger rights guidelines in favor of wealthy regulars. Tonight, I terminated Richard Caldwell, Cedric Harrington, and Todd Evans at JFK Gate B24 for gross misconduct and system manipulation. Draft the severance denial paperwork immediately for cause. Furthermore, initiate a full audit of all middle management training protocols starting Monday. Promote Reserve Purser Sarah Jenkins to Fleet Training Director. She understands service without sycophancy. Let's clean this up. She hit send. Across the aisle, Arthur Pendleton cleared his throat, leaning as far toward the aisle as his seatbelt would allow. "Ms. Quinn," he whispered, his voice trembling with a pathetic desperation. I just wanted to formally apologize for my earlier comments. I was stressed. I was entirely out of line. Braylin didn't look up from her tablet. "Your apology is noted, Mr. Pendleton. Your credit facility remains intact. However, I have flagged your file. If your firm attempts to leverage its size to bully my underwriters again, the deal is dead. Now please let me sleep." Arthur swallowed hard, sinking back into his chair. The airplane pushed back from the gate. As the massive Boeing 777 taxied toward the runway and eventually roared into the dark New York sky, the silence in first class remained absolute. The financial world woke up on Monday morning to a seismic shock. At precisely 8 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, the opening bell of the New York Stock Exchange was overshadowed by a press release blasting across the Bloomberg terminal, Reuters, and the Financial Times. Vanguard Holdings, the trillion-dollar private equity titan, had acquired the struggling Meridian Airlines for $4.2 billion in an all-cash transaction. But the real drama wasn't happening on Wall Street. It was unfolding on the fifth floor of the Meridian Airlines corporate headquarters in Chicago, inside the sterile, fluorescent-lit offices of Human Resources. Cedric Harrington, Richard Caldwell, and Todd Evans sat side by side in a row of uncomfortable plastic chairs in the waiting area. They looked like ghosts. The bravado Cedric had worn like armor at JFK was entirely gone. She was pale, chewing furiously on her thumbnail. Richard looked to have aged 10 years over the weekend, his expensive suit hanging slightly loose on his frame. Todd was staring at the floor, occasionally letting out a quiet, panicked sigh. For the past 48 hours, they had tried to convince themselves that the nightmare on Flight 802 was an overreaction. Richard had even called his union representative, confident that his 20 years of seniority would shield him from a sudden, on-the-spot firing by a billionaire who was having a bad day. He believed the union would force Vanguard to rehire him with back pay. At 9:15 a.m., the heavy oak door to the director's office swung open. David Croft, a notorious, ruthlessly efficient HR executive who had been flown in by Vanguard Holdings specifically to handle the transition, stood in the doorway. He held 3 thick manila folders. "Harrington, Caldwell, Evans." "Inside," Croft said, his voice entirely devoid of emotion. The 3 former employees shuffled into the office and sat before the massive mahogany desk. A union representative, a tired-looking man named Greg, was already sitting in the corner reviewing a tablet. Richard immediately looked at the union rep. "Greg, tell them, they can't do this. I have 2 decades with this airline. I made one mistake regarding a boarding pass. It's a verbal warning at best." David Croft didn't sit down. He tossed the 3 folders onto the desk. "This is not a negotiation, and this is not a disciplinary hearing," Croft said flatly. "This is a formal termination, proceeding for gross misconduct, violation of federal anti-discrimination laws, and fraudulent manipulation of the corporate ticketing system." Cedric choked back a sob. "Fraudulent? We didn't commit fraud. The system locked up, and we thought she was a scammer." "You didn't think," Croft corrected sharply. "You assumed. And then, instead of calling the supervisor desk as mandated by Section 4 of your operating manual, you attempted to forcefully override a Level 1 corporate hold. When that failed, you instructed Mr. Evans to print a dummy ticket to forcibly relocate a first-class passenger to the rear of the aircraft out of pure spite. We pulled the keystroke logs from Gate B24. We have the timestamps. You tried to hack your own company's system because you didn't like a passenger's sweatshirt." Todd buried his face in his hands. "Oh my God." "Greg," Richard pleaded, turning to the union rep, "you have to fight this. She threatened me. Braylon Quinn came onto my plane looking for a fight." Greg, the union rep, set his tablet down. He looked at Richard with a mixture of disgust and pity. "Richard, I've reviewed the flight manifest, the security footage from the gate, and the sworn incident report filed by Captain Mitchell. You publicly berated the new owner of the airline. You physically blocked her path. You threatened to have her arrested by Port Authority for sitting in a seat she legally owned. The union protects workers from unfair labor practices. It does not protect employees who engage in intentional, malicious profiling and insubordination. The union is declining to grieve your termination." The words hit Richard like a physical blow. He slumped back in his chair, the last shred of his arrogant invincibility evaporating into thin air. He wasn't just losing his job, he was losing the protection of the very system he thought made him untouchable. "As of this morning," Croft continued, pacing behind his desk, "your health benefits are severed. Because you are being terminated for cause, specifically violations of company integrity and security policies, you are ineligible for the standard severance package. Furthermore, Richard, your early retirement travel perks are permanently revoked." "You're destroying my life over 5 minutes," Cedric whispered, tears finally spilling over her cheeks. "I can't put this on my resume. I'll never get hired at a premium carrier again." "Actions have consequences, Ms. Harrington," Croft replied coldly. "You built a career acting as a gatekeeper, deciding who was worthy of respect based on superficial metrics. You humiliated people. The sheer arrogance it takes to laugh in a passenger's face simply because they don't look wealthy enough to meet your personal standards is a liability Vanguard Holdings will not tolerate. You played a dangerous game of status, and you lost to someone who actually holds it." Croft opened the door to the hallway. Standing outside were 2 large corporate security guards. "Your final paychecks, prorated to Friday evening, have been direct deposited," Croft finalized, gesturing to the door. "Security will escort you to the lobby. You are legally trespassed from all Meridian Airlines and Vanguard Holdings properties worldwide. Good day." The walk of shame through the corporate lobby was excruciating. As Cedric, Richard, and Todd were marched out by security, hundreds of Meridian employees watched in hushed silence. The story of the gate agents who laughed at the billionaire CEO had already spread like wildfire through the company intranet. They were no longer respected veterans of the airline. They were cautionary tales. When the glass doors of the headquarters slid shut behind them, locking them out onto the cold Chicago pavement, the harsh reality of their karma finally settled in. They had traded their careers, their reputations, and their futures for 5 minutes of petty laughter. And now, the only thing they had left was a profound, suffocating silence. The incident at Gate B24 became an industry legend, a modern-day fable whispered in airport break rooms and corporate training seminars around the globe. It served as a stark, unforgiving reminder that true power rarely announces itself with loud demands or flashy attire, and that respect is not a currency to be doled out only to those who appear wealthy. Braylon Quinn did not orchestrate the encounter to be cruel. She used it as a necessary scalpel to excise a toxic culture of entitlement from her new acquisition. Under her leadership and Vanguard Holdings restructuring, Meridian Airlines flourished, eventually becoming the gold standard for equitable, high-end customer service. The arrogant gatekeepers were replaced by professionals who understood that dignity is universal. In the end, the cruel laughter of a few elitist employees cost them their entire world, proving that arrogance is the most expensive baggage one can carry.